Emma's evening was as ordinary as any other. The street was quiet, the soft rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze the only sound accompanying her footsteps. She held her worn leather purse close, its familiar weight a comfort as she navigated the dimly lit cobblestones leading to her apartment. The lamps cast a pale yellow glow, elongating shadows and painting the road in patches of light and dark. Suddenly, a figure emerged from an alleyway. The man wore a hood, and the gleam of a knife caught the light as he stepped in front of her. Time seemed to slow. Emma's pulse throbbed in her ears as her breath caught in her throat. "Hand it over," he demanded, voice low and menacing. Emma's hands trembled as she struggled to respond, the fear thick in her chest. Before she could comply, a voice, deep and commanding, sliced through the tension. "Step away from her." The voice belonged to an old man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He was thin, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, alive with an intensity that belied his frail appearance. Emma's eyes darted between the man and her assailant, who sneered at the interruption. "Old man, this isn't your fight," the robber said, taking a step toward him, the knife clutched tighter in his fist. The old man moved with surprising swiftness. In a blur of motion, he seized the robber's wrist, twisting it with such force that the knife clattered to the ground. A gasp escaped Emma's lips as the would-be thief's eyes widened in shock and pain. Stumbling backward, the man cursed under his breath before turning and running off into the darkness. Emma stood frozen, her breath ragged. The old man turned to her, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "Are you all right, miss?" For the first time she noticed a faded tattoo on his arm, peeking out from under the sleeve of his worn jacket. It was intricate, a symbol that seemed familiar, yet foreign. Yes, I'm fine." "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice wavering with adrenaline and gratitude. "Take care," he said simply, the smile still ghosting his lips before he turned and walked away, his steps unhurried as if he had merely intervened in a minor inconvenience. Emma watched him go, curiosity mingling with her relief. Who was this man who moved like a soldier, who carried himself with such quiet confidence? The symbol on his arm lingered in her mind as she made her way home. Emma couldn't shake the encounter from her thoughts the next morning. As she sat at her small desk in the non-profit office where she worked, her mind kept wandering back to the old man with the soldier's reflexes and the enigmatic tattoo. "Earth to Emma?" Her colleague Lila waved a hand in front of her face. "You've been staring at the same file for 10 minutes. Everything okay?" Emma blinked, giving Lila a small smile. "Yeah, just a weird thing happened last night." She recounted the story, watching Lila's eyes widen with each detail. When Emma mentioned the tattoo, Lila's expression changed to one of intrigue. "Did it look like this?" Lila pulled up an image on her phone, an old war insignia from an elite WWII unit. Emma's heart quickened as she recognized the symbol, or at least something very similar. "I think so," Emma said, leaning in closer. The realization that this man might have been a soldier, and not just any soldier, but part of an elite group, made the encounter even more compelling. "Do you know who he is?" Lila asked, her voice lowered as if they were sharing a secret. Emma shook her head. "But I'm going to find out." The next morning, Emma found herself at the entrance of Joe's Corner Cafe, a small, cozy spot known for its welcoming atmosphere and the gentle hum of conversation. It was where Arthur Sullivan, as Emma would soon learn, spent his mornings. Inside, the cafe was alive with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden squares across the checkered floor. Emma spotted him immediately. The old man sat at a corner table by the window, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him and a newspaper in hand. His eyes, though tired, were alert as he scanned the headlines. Gathering her courage, Emma approached. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir." Arthur looked up, a hint of surprise flickering across his face before his expression settled into a polite smile. "Yes, miss?" "I wanted to thank you properly for last night," Emma said, shifting her weight nervously. "If you hadn't been there—" Arthur waved a dismissive hand. Anyone would have done the same. But not everyone did, Emma replied, her eyes searching his face for any hint of the stories he held. Maggie, the cafe owner, walked by with a knowing smile. Arthur's always been looking out for people, she said, pausing at their table, even if he doesn't say much about it. Emma glanced at Maggie, who gave a small nod before walking away, leaving a hint of mystery hanging in the air. Emma turned back to Arthur. Forgive me if this sounds odd, but I couldn't help but notice the tattoo on your arm. It looked like an insignia from the war. Arthur's smile faded slightly, and for a moment his gaze turned distant. You have a keen eye, he said finally, his voice softer now. It's an old mark, from a long time ago. Were you in the war? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur's eyes met hers, a storm of memories swirling within them. Yes, he said, but that's a story for another day. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, a mix of anticipation and unease. She knew that behind Arthur's quiet demeanor was a tale of heroism, sacrifice, and perhaps pain, a story that was now hers to uncover. Emma couldn't shake Arthur's words or the look in his eyes. That evening she sat at her small kitchen table, the light from her laptop casting a bluish glow across her face. The cafe encounter replayed in her mind as she typed variations of WWII Elite Unit Insignia and Tattoo, scrolling through pages of historical archives and old photographs. After what felt like hours, she found an old newspaper article buried in an online archive. The grainy photo showed a group of soldiers in uniform, faces young but hardened by war. Emma's breath caught when she spotted a man standing in the back row, a determined expression on his face. It was Arthur, decades younger but unmistakable, the same tattoo visible on his arm. The caption read, Arthur Sullivan, decorated hero of the 23rd Battalion. Emma's heart raced as she read the short blurb beneath the photo. Known for a daring rescue mission deep behind enemy lines, Sullivan's bravery has been commemorated in stories passed down but rarely shared. It was clear that Arthur was more than just a veteran. He was a hero, and yet, why had he chosen to live so quietly, hidden away from recognition? The night was cool and still as Arthur sat in his modest living room, the only sound the creak of the old rocking chair beneath him. He reached out for the faded photo album resting on the side table, its leather cover worn smooth from years of handling. Inside were photographs that spoke of another life, a young Arthur in uniform, friends with broad smiles that belied the darkness they'd faced. He flipped through the pages slowly, memories flaring to life with each turn. A particular photo stopped him. His squad gathered around a campfire, faces illuminated by the flickering flames. It was the night before that mission, the one that had haunted his dreams ever since. Arthur closed his eyes, the scene playing in his mind like an old film. The shouts, the gunfire, the overwhelming sense of duty battling against the fear that clawed at his chest. His breath quickened as fragments of the past, jagged and relentless, invaded his thoughts. Get it together, he muttered to himself, placing a hand over his eyes until the memories retreated into the shadows. He sighed, the weight of years pressing down on him. He knew Emma was digging into his past, and he feared what she might uncover, not for himself, but for those who hadn't come home. The next day, Emma's curiosity deepened. She spent her lunch break at the local library, searching for any public records about Arthur's unit. With the help of the librarian, an elderly woman who had seen generations come and go, Emma unearthed a faded book titled Unsung Heroes, Tales of Bravery from WWII. It was filled with short accounts of extraordinary acts, many of them credited to anonymous soldiers. One chapter stood out: The Phantom Rescuer. The story described a covert mission that saved dozens of lives during a critical turning point in the war. Details were sparse, but one line sent chills down Emma's spine. The man, known only by his unit's mark, led them through enemy territory under cover of darkness, guiding them to safety at great personal risk. Emma's thoughts raced. Could this be Arthur? The details fit: the mark, the timeline, the description of a man who shunned the spotlight. She snapped a picture of the page with her phone and made her way to the cafe, the need for answers burning within her. Arthur was not at the cafe that day, but Maggie was. The cafe owner, with her kind eyes and warm smile, had known Arthur for years. Emma approached her, the urgency clear in her voice. "Maggie, do you know much about Arthur's past?" Maggie's eyes softened as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Ah, Arthur doesn't like to talk about those days, but yes, I know a little. He was a hero, though he'd never admit it, saved a lot of lives during the war." "Why won't he talk about it?" Emma pressed gently, sensing that Maggie held more than she was saying. Maggie sighed, glancing around before lowering her voice. "It's not just the war that keeps him silent, dear. There were things that happened afterward, things that weighed heavily on him. The war didn't end when he came home. It followed him, as it did many others." Emma nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle starting to form a clearer picture. Arthur's silence wasn't just reluctance. It was the result of scars far deeper than she'd imagined. Arthur sat by his window that evening, the setting sun casting long golden streaks across his small living room. He held an old pocket watch in his hand, its surface scratched and dull with age. It had belonged to a friend, one of the men he'd led through that fateful night. He thumbed the watch open, listening to the soft tick, the sound steady and unyielding, a counterpoint to the chaos that once surrounded it. The night came back to him in pieces. The thick fog, the sound of boots crunching on gravel, the whispered commands, the sense of every breath counting, every second borrowed, the eyes of his comrades, wide with trust and fear, looking to him for guidance, and the moment when it all went wrong, the shout that shattered the silence, the flash of gunfire, the feeling of failure as some fell and didn't get back up. Arthur rubbed his temple, trying to force the memories away, but tonight they wouldn't be buried. He wondered if Emma's curiosity would bring them back in full force, if the past he'd fought to contain would finally spill out. Emma's persistence paid off when she found a veteran willing to talk, a man named Paul, who had served with Arthur and now lived in the nearby retirement community. She visited him on a crisp afternoon, her heart pounding with anticipation. Paul's eyes lit up when Emma mentioned Arthur. Arthur Sullivan. Now there's a man of steel if ever there was one. He led us through hell and back, and not once did he take credit for it. Emma leaned forward. But why won't he talk about it? Paul's expression grew serious. Because to him, it's not just a tale of heroics. It's a tale of what we lost, of those who didn't come home. Arthur carries that weight like a stone in his heart. You see, there was more to that mission than most knew, a betrayal that could have cost us all our lives. Emma's eyes widened, her mind racing. What betrayal? And how had Arthur kept this secret for so long? The answers seemed closer, but so did the questions that would change everything. Emma spent the next few days piecing together everything she had learned. The story of Arthur Sullivan was beginning to take shape, but there were still unanswered questions that gnawed at her. The veteran Paul's words echoed in her mind. A betrayal that could have cost us all our lives. With this new angle, Emma drafted an article for the local paper. She focused on Arthur's heroics, writing about the mission that had saved countless soldiers. She kept the betrayal Paul mentioned vague, hinting at it but not revealing enough to draw attention to Arthur's private battles. The article was meant to honor him, to show the town the quiet strength of a man they passed by without a second glance. When the article was published, it spread quickly. People in the small town began to look at Arthur differently. Strangers stopped by his table at the cafe to thank him, and old friends reached out, sharing stories Emma hadn't heard before. The attention unsettled Arthur at first. He was used to the quiet, to being invisible, and now eyes followed him with admiration and curiosity. Emma sat by the window in the cafe, watching as people approached Arthur. The once secluded corner where he sat was now bustling with visitors, young and old. Some brought letters from fathers and grandfathers who had served, eager to share stories with the man who had become a living legend overnight. Arthur's expression was reserved, but Emma could see the flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of pride and pain. When Maggie came over with a fresh cup of coffee, she whispered to Emma, "I haven't seen Arthur smile like that in years." Across the room, a young man, barely 20, handed Arthur a letter. "This is from my grandfather," he said nervously. "He said you saved his life. He never talked about the war until he read your story." Arthur's hands trembled as he took the letter, and for the first time, Emma saw a tear slide down his cheek. That evening, Emma finally gathered the courage to approach Arthur directly. She found him sitting alone at the cafe, staring at the unopened letter. "I'm sorry if the article brought up difficult memories," Emma said quietly. Arthur looked up, his eyes tired but soft. "No need to apologize, miss. It was bound to surface one day. I just hoped. Perhaps it would be after I was gone." Emma felt a pang of guilt. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked. "Paul mentioned a betrayal. What happened on that mission, Arthur?" Arthur's jaw clenched, and he let out a shaky breath. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was a good man, but not everyone we trusted was." Emma's heart raced. "My grandfather? What did he do?" "No." Arthur shook his head, eyes fixed on the table. "Not him, but someone he protected." Arthur told her about a lieutenant named Marcus Reed, a man who had been part of their unit and had shared their bond. But Reed had been working for the other side, feeding information to the enemy. On the night of the mission, Reed's betrayal had almost cost them everything. Emma listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as Arthur recounted the night in detail. Reed had revealed their position, and the ambush that followed was swift and brutal. Arthur's quick thinking and leadership had saved most of the men, but the cost had been high. Her grandfather had been the one who discovered Reed's treachery, and in the chaos had confronted him. The struggle ended with Reed's death, a secret that had been buried with the men who survived. "Your grandfather swore to keep it quiet to protect the unit," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "He knew the truth would tarnish everything we fought for." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Her grandfather's heroism was legendary in her family, but this was a part of him she had never known. The weight of Arthur's words settled over her, reshaping the story she thought she understood. Emma spent the following days researching further, now armed with the knowledge Arthur had shared. She found more veterans willing to speak, their stories echoing what Arthur had told her. They talked about the nights when sleep was impossible, haunted by memories of gunfire and the weight of lost comrades. Arthur, meanwhile, found himself more open to the attention his story had drawn. The visits from other veterans were bittersweet. They shared moments of camaraderie and grief. Emma often sat nearby, listening to the fragments of stories that surfaced between old friends. The truth about the mission was beginning to feel less like a burden and more like a shared history that needed to be told. One morning, Emma found a small, yellowed envelope in her mailbox with her name written in her grandfather's handwriting. It was a letter that had never been delivered, dated just after he had returned from the war. Emma's hands shook as she read it aloud to Arthur later that day. "If you're reading this, it means the story has come to light. Know that what we did for the right reasons, even if history chooses to forget it. I've carried both pride and regret in equal measure, but men like Arthur Sullivan should never be forgotten. He carried us when no one else could. He was our strength." Tears blurred Emma's vision as she finished the letter, and Arthur sat in silence, eyes closed as if hearing the words brought peace he hadn't felt in years. As Emma continued to write about the stories she uncovered, her articles inspired others to speak out. The town became a place where veterans felt seen and heard, and Arthur found himself surrounded by people who finally understood. Emma launched a community program to help veterans share their stories and connect with others. Arthur attended the first gathering, sitting among faces old and new, his presence a symbol of resilience and quiet heroism. The culmination of Emma's efforts was a ceremony to honor the veterans in the town, with Arthur as the guest of honor. Veterans shared their stories, laughter and tears blending into a single chorus of shared understanding. Arthur stood at the podium, his hands steady as he spoke for the first time in years. He talked not of glory, but of the weight of leadership, the sacrifices, and the bonds that never broke. The applause was thunderous, but it was the quiet, knowing nods from fellow veterans that meant the most. After the ceremony, a man approached Arthur, his cane tapping against the floor. Arthur's eyes widened in recognition, another veteran he had thought lost. They embraced, and the room seemed to hold its breath as they shared whispered words, a lifetime of unsaid things passing between them in an instant. Emma watched, a sense of fulfillment washing over her. Arthur's story was complete, not because of what was said that day, but because he had finally been seen for who he truly was. Emma published a book, weaving together the stories of veterans, and started a foundation in Arthur's name. Arthur's final years were spent surrounded by friends and community members who cherished him. The nightmares that had once haunted him grew quieter, replaced by evenings at the cafe with Maggie and Emma, recounting stories of bravery and shared laughter. Finally, Arthur was sitting by the window, the morning sun warming his face as he watched the world wake up. The letter from Emma's grandfather sat on the table beside him, a reminder that stories lived on, not just in history, but in the people who listened. Emma's voice narrated the closing words. In the end, heroism isn't about the moments we are seen, but the moments we endure when no one is watching. Continuing with more detailed expansion of key chapters, focusing on emotional depth, character interactions, and specific plot details. After reading her grandfather's letter to Arthur, Emma felt a newfound determination. She knew there were more stories like his, untold, locked away in the memories of veterans who'd chosen silence over recognition. The letter's words resonated with her. Men like Arthur Sullivan should never be forgotten. Emma spent the next weeks interviewing other veterans from the 23rd Battalion. Each man she spoke to pieced together fragments of that fateful mission. Some recalled Arthur's quick thinking, his steady hand as he led them through chaos. Others spoke of the night's fear, of trust fractured by betrayal and bound again by Arthur's leadership. Each story she gathered revealed another layer to Arthur's character, his courage, his empathy, and his relentless pursuit to bring his men home. Arthur sat by his window at night, the dim light of the city casting soft shadows across his living room. His thoughts wandered to the faces of his comrades, their laughter during brief respites, the grim determination before each mission. The past few weeks had stirred emotions long buried, making sleep a stranger. He picked up the letter Emma had read aloud, tracing his finger over the familiar handwriting. It was as if her grandfather's voice reached out from the past, telling Arthur it was time to let go of the guilt and embrace the pride he'd tried to ignore. Arthur sighed, a quiet, heavy sound that carried years of silence. "If only they could see us now," he murmured, eyes misting over as he imagined the young men, unchanged by time, standing beside him. Emma's research brought her to a forgotten archive at the local historical society. Dusty boxes and yellowed papers surrounded her as she sifted through documents that hadn't seen light in decades. She found what she hadn't dared hope for, a declassified report marked with redactions and the name of Marcus Reed. Emma's eyes widened as she read about the mission that had been both Arthur's greatest triumph and most painful memory. The report confirmed what Paul had hinted. Reed had betrayed them, and it was Arthur's intervention that prevented disaster. But the report also noted her grandfather's role, omitting the confrontation and final moments that Arthur had shared. Emma snapped a picture of the document, knowing she had the missing piece of her story. The next day, Emma met Arthur in the park where he often sat on the old bench, watching passers-by and feeding the birds. She handed him the copy of the report, her expression serious. "I found it," she said quietly. "It doesn't say everything, but it shows you were right." Arthur took the paper with a steady hand, his face betraying a mixture of relief and sorrow. "So, the truth has found its way out," he said, his voice rough. "Arthur, people need to know that you didn't just save lives. You saved their stories, their legacies," Emma insisted, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Arthur looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. If it helps others find peace, then it's worth it. Emma's articles began to take on a life of their own, shared beyond the small town and reaching audiences across the state. Veterans from other places started to write in, sharing their experiences and offering gratitude. Arthur's once quiet life became a hub of activity, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for decades. Emma worked tirelessly to set up events at local schools and community centers where Arthur and other veterans spoke about their experiences. For many of them, it was the first time they had shared their stories publicly, and the audience listened, captivated not by tales of battle, but by the humanity behind them, the bonds of friendship, the fear, the sacrifice, and the hope that carried them through. The community center was filled to capacity, with people spilling into the hallway. Arthur sat in the front row, a place he never imagined himself, surrounded by veterans who had come to honor him. Emma took the stage first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Tonight, we recognize not just one man's courage, but the collective bravery and resilience of those who stood with him. Arthur Sullivan taught us that heroism isn't always loud. It's quiet, determined, and often unseen. The crowd applauded as Emma stepped back, and Arthur took his place at the podium. His hands, once steady with purpose on a battlefield, now held notes that he didn't need. He spoke from the heart, sharing stories not of victories but of moments that defined him and those who had served with him. He spoke of loss and survival, and the strength of the men who stood beside him. As he finished, there was a moment of profound silence before the room erupted in applause. Arthur looked out at the faces before him, no longer strangers, but a community bound by understanding. After the ceremony, Emma and Arthur continued to share stories, visiting other towns and connecting with veterans groups. Arthur's voice, once hesitant and filled with ghosts, grew stronger as he realized that his words helped others find peace. Emma's book, The Silent Heroes, chronicled these stories and became a source of healing for many. Arthur watched as Emma flourished, inspired by the resilience she witnessed. He knew that her grandfather would have been proud of her, just as he was. She carried forward not just his legacy, but the legacy of all those who had been overlooked. At one of their speaking events, an older man in the back of the room stood up as Arthur spoke. He wore a worn hat with a unit insignia, and Arthur's voice caught in his throat as he recognized him. It was James Cartwright, a soldier he had believed killed in action. Their eyes met, and the years melted away in that moment. After the event, they embraced, exchanging stories and filling in the missing pieces of their shared past. The reunion was a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost and what they had found again. Arthur and James spent hours reminiscing, finding laughter in memories that had once been too painful to touch. The town welcomed James as another hero, and the community events expanded to include more veterans who came to tell their stories. Emma watched as Arthur's once shadowed existence became a beacon of hope. Arthur's story came full circle when Emma published her book, and the foundation they established began to help veterans tell their stories across the country. Arthur's apartment, once quiet and lonely, now buzzed with visitors, from schoolchildren eager to learn history to old friends coming to share coffee and memories. As Arthur sat by his window one morning, the world bathed in the soft light of dawn, he felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He was at peace, surrounded by friends, honored by those who knew his name and those who didn't. Emma sat with him, a notebook in her lap, ready for the next chapter of stories to be told. Arthur looked at her, a smile breaking across his face as he whispered, "Some stories were never meant to be kept silent." Arthur sat in his familiar spot by the window, the early morning light painting the room with soft hues of gold and pink. The once muted walls of his small apartment now carried photos, letters, and mementos from countless veterans and community members who had come to know him and share their stories. The air buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined his home. Emma sat across from him, a notebook balanced on her lap, scribbling down notes from their latest conversation. She paused to look up, watching Arthur gaze out the window with a serene smile. "You know," Arthur said, his voice gravelly but warm, "I used to dread the mornings. They were reminders that another day had to be faced. But now, they remind me that life still holds surprises." Emma's chest tightened with emotion. She had seen the change in him over the past few months, the way his shoulders no longer sagged under invisible weight, how his eyes held a spark that had been absent when they first met. "You gave that to me, Emma," Arthur continued, turning to meet her eyes. "You and all those who were brave enough to listen." Emma reached out and squeezed his hand, the quiet strength of the man she had come to admire palpable. "No, Arthur, you gave it to us. We're just here to tell your story." The doorbell rang, startling them both. Emma rose to answer it, exchanging a surprised glance with Arthur as she opened the door to find a middle-aged man in military dress uniform standing there. His hair was graying at the temples, and he held a folder under one arm. "Mr. Sullivan?" he asked, stepping forward with a respectful nod. Arthur pushed himself up from his chair, eyes narrowing in recognition. "Yes, that's me. I'm Major Caldwell from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've come to thank you personally for what you've done for this community and for your service all those years ago," the man said, extending a hand. "Your story has reached places you wouldn't believe." Arthur's jaw worked silently for a moment before he clasped the Major's hand. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Major Caldwell said with a smile. "But we do have something for you." He handed Arthur the folder, which contained an official commendation and a medal he had never received for his service during the war, a recognition lost in the chaos of shifting records and time. Emma watched, eyes shining as Arthur traced the medal with trembling fingers. It was a symbol of honor long overdue, and seeing it now in his twilight years was a moment she would never forget. The recognition spurred more visits from veterans and families eager to share their stories or simply shake Arthur's hand. He became a local fixture at schools, community centers, and veteran gatherings, speaking not just of battles fought, but of the friendships that had carried him through and the sacrifices made for each other. Arthur found a new purpose in guiding young veterans who struggled with their own silent battles. He spoke candidly about his journey, not hiding the scars of war but showing that healing was possible through connection and courage. Emma documented these moments, turning them into articles and stories that inspired people far beyond their town. Her book, The Silent Heroes, became a bestseller, sparking conversations about the quiet strength of veterans everywhere. The foundation Emma and Arthur had started celebrated its first anniversary with a gala that brought together veterans, their families, and supporters. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and laughter filled the air as memories were honored and new bonds were formed. Arthur sat at a table surrounded by men and women who had once felt invisible. He watched as they spoke with pride, their voices no longer hidden in the margins of history. For the first time in decades, he felt that the weight he carried was shared, lifted by the hands of those who understood. "Arthur," Emma said as she sat beside him, raising a glass of sparkling water, "to stories that matter and the people brave enough to tell them." "To life," Arthur said softly, clinking his glass against hers, eyes glistening under the warm light. Arthur made it his mission to visit the graves of his fallen comrades, leaving tokens and letters that spoke of their bravery and his gratitude. Emma joined him, documenting the experience and sharing the poignant moments with the Foundation's followers. One day, at the grave of his closest friend, Arthur read aloud the words he had written decades earlier but never shared. "We did our best, and you were the bravest of us all. Your story isn't lost. It lives in me, in Emma, and in everyone who learns who you truly were." As the years went by, Arthur began to feel the slow embrace of age. Emma, now married and with children of her own, continued the work they had started. She ensured that Arthur's legacy, and that of all the silent heroes, remained a guiding light for generations. Arthur, still present at events and gatherings, watched with pride as new faces took on the roles of storytellers and champions for veterans. He sat with Emma's eldest son, a bright-eyed boy named after his great-grandfather, telling him stories that the boy listened to with wide-eyed wonder. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple, Arthur sat by the window. The room was filled with the soft hum of life outside, voices and laughter mingling with the warm breeze. Emma's book sat on the table beside him, its pages worn and loved. He reached for the pocket watch, its ticking now a familiar comfort. Opening it, he traced the initials engraved inside, a reminder of the bond that had carried him through the hardest days. Arthur closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his lips. He felt no regrets, only gratitude for the journey that had taken him from the shadows into the light, surrounded by stories that lived on, whispered and cherished. As the last rays of sun bathed the room in a golden glow, Emma's voice echoed in his mind. Some stories were never meant to be kept silent. And with that, he knew they never would be. Years passed, and Arthur's story, along with the stories of countless veterans, continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Emma's foundation grew into a national movement, helping veterans from all walks of life find their voices and share their experiences. Schools began to include first-hand accounts of veterans in their history lessons, not just focusing on battles won or lost, but on the people who fought them, their fears, courage, and the friendships that sustained them. Arthur's name became synonymous with resilience and humility. The local park where he'd once sat in quiet reflection was renamed Sullivan Square, a place where families gathered, children played, and veterans found peace. A bronze statue of Arthur stood there, seated with a warm smile, a notebook open in his lap as if ready to listen to yet another story. Emma visited the park regularly with her family. Her children played on the grass while she sat on the bench next to the statue, remembering the man who had taught her that the quietest stories were often the most powerful. She reached out to touch the bronze pages, feeling the cool metal under her fingertips, a reminder that the past was now etched into the present for future generations to see. One sunny afternoon, Emma's eldest son, now a teenager with his great-grandfather's name, sat beside her. He looked up at the statue, then at his mother. "Mom, will you tell me more about Arthur? I've heard you talk about him so many times, but I want to know everything." Emma smiled, the familiar tug of emotion warming her chest. "Of course," she said, looking at the statue as if Arthur himself could hear. She began recounting his stories, weaving in the memories he had shared, the lessons he'd imparted, and the moments that had defined his life. As she spoke, other children gathered around, their young faces eager and curious. It reminded Emma of the day she first approached Arthur, full of questions and seeking answers. Now, she was the storyteller, passing down the legacy he had entrusted to her. Emma's foundation continued to expand its reach, establishing workshops and programs to teach veterans how to write their stories, speak to audiences, and mentor the next generation. The foundation's motto, taken from Arthur's own words, became a source of inspiration. Every story is worth telling, and every voice deserves to be heard. Veterans' stories, once whispered in lonely rooms, were now shared in community halls, schools, and online. They spoke of loss, love, courage, and the bonds that transcended time. The Foundation's annual event, Sullivan Day, brought together thousands of people to honor those stories, to listen and learn, and to carry forward the lessons that Arthur and his comrades had lived by. On the 10th anniversary of Arthur's passing, Emma stood on the stage at the Sullivan Day event. The crowd was larger than ever, a testament to how far the movement had come. She held a copy of The Silent Heroes in one hand, its edges worn from years of reading and sharing. "We gather here not just to remember, but to honor and continue the work that Arthur Sullivan inspired," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the sea of faces. "He taught us that bravery isn't just in the fight, but in the willingness to share your truth, to let others see the parts of yourself you've kept hidden. And he taught us that we all carry stories worth telling." The crowd stood in silence for a moment, heads bowed in reflection. The air was filled with the weight of stories untold, the echoes of memories shared, and the promise that they would be remembered. As the event continued, Emma looked out at the crowd, her heart full. Arthur's story had not ended with him. It lived in the people who shared their own stories, who listened with open hearts, and who found comfort in knowing that they were not alone. Emma walked to the edge of the park as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over Sullivan Square. She watched as her children ran through the grass, their laughter ringing out like music. The statue of Arthur seemed almost alive in the fading light, his bronze smile a permanent fixture that would greet generations to come. With a deep breath, Emma felt the familiar ache of missing him, tempered by the gratitude of having known him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pocket watch Arthur had once cherished, a gift he'd given her on the day the foundation was established. "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered, holding the watch tightly as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Your story will never be silent." And as the last rays of light kissed the sky, Emma knew that it was true. The legacy of Arthur Sullivan and all the silent heroes would live on, carried in the hearts of those who listened, learned, and shared. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with friends and family to honor the silent heroes in your life. Remember, every story matters, and every voice deserves to be heard. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of resilience and bravery. And if you'd like to support our mission of bringing veteran stories to light, visit our channel and consider joining our community or contributing to the cause. Together, we can keep these stories alive and ensure that no story, big or small, is left untold. Thank you for watching, listening, and being part of this journey.